Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Haley Cohen Gilliland is with us, author of A Flower Traveled in My Blood, one of the most riveting books I've read in a long time. Riveting because it paints a horrific picture of what can come with autocracy. The powerful book is about an atrocity, the post-Perón period in Argentina, where a military junta ruled the roost. Masked agents exited unmarked cars to swoop people off the streets or from their homes, and in many cases killed them with a bullet to the head or by throwing them in the sea from a plane or helicopter. Families were separated. Pregnant women were allowed to bear their children while their husbands were tortured or killed. The babies were given for adoption to members of the military, after which the mothers were killed too. Haley's story is of the grandmothers, the abuelas, who searched for their stolen grandchildren for decades and what they found. The book is a bestseller, reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Sunday Book Review, and in my view is destined for a Pulitzer. We are pleased to welcome Haley Cohen Gilliland to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
Well, thank you for coming. Congratulations on the book. It really is a wonderful read. But tell us something about your background, and particularly your background in Argentina, and what led you to write this.
Yeah, those questions are intertwined, certainly. So I moved to Argentina in 2011, shortly after graduating college. And I moved down with a background knowledge of what had happened during the dictatorship. I knew that the military regime had disappeared tens of thousands of Argentines during that time, but I was shocked to learn the extent of the brutality once I was living in Argentina. And the thing that I found most shocking was, as you mentioned in your intro, the fact that the military had abducted pregnant women, held them in captivity until they gave birth, and then separated them from their babies and quietly disappeared the women, and then placed their babies with military and police families to be raised under false identities. And I became absolutely obsessed with the abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, who are the subject of my book. These incredibly brave and intrepid grandmothers who banded together at immense risk to themselves. They easily could have been disappeared for this work themselves during the dictatorship to find and recover those stolen babies who were their grandchildren. So that's how I was first introduced to the story.
And the Plaza de Mayo was where they gathered for protest almost on a daily basis.
So after about a year of the dictatorship, the mothers and grandmothers who were looking for their disappeared children and their stolen grandchildren realized that they weren't going to get anywhere by asking the very government that took their family members for information. They had been going to the Ministry of Interior and courthouses and jails, and largely they were stonewalled or even treated really hostilely. And so after about a year of suffering these indignities, they decided that what they were going to do was gather each week in the Plaza de Mayo, which is this iconic square in front of Argentina's presidential palace.
In Buenos Aires.
In Buenos Aires, so the heart of the city and therefore the heart of the country, and demand answers from the dictatorship. And they were not going to stop marching until they got those answers. And so that's where the abuelas derived their name from. And this was incredibly dangerous. Protests were banned at this time. And in fact, several members of the Madres movement that was allied with the grandmothers did disappear during this time. And so it was incredibly risky what they did.
There was also treachery involved. Didn't the government infiltrate the abuelas and then report who the leaders were, and then they were disposed of?
Yes. So at one point, a naval officer, a young naval officer, posed as the grieving brother of a disappeared person, and he presented himself to the mothers and the grandmothers who were marching in the Plaza de Mayo, suggesting that he was just looking for his twin brother who had disappeared. And in fact, he was a naval officer, and he was gathering information about the leadership of these movements, and ultimately that was what led to 3 of their disappearances.
What about the role of the church in all this? Didn't some of the abuelas or the madres go to priests and try to find out information about the disappeared ones?
Yes, so both the madres and the abuelas often went to members of the church either in search of information or for solace. And the responses varied across the church, but for the most part, Argentina's leadership, the leadership of the Catholic Church, was very tightly intertwined with the Argentine military. And in some cases, priests were actually actively abetting the dictatorship. So in the book, I described the case of one particular priest who would meet with these distraught mothers and grandmothers about their loved ones, and all the while he was actually taking notes about those interviews, taking down their names, their addresses, writing them on cards, and then he turned those cards over to the military government so that they could pursue those people as targets.
And just to set all this in time, first we think of Argentina, in New York anyway, we think of Evita. Well, Evita died in the 1950s, and Perón was there in the 1970s. It was his comeback. He was married to Isabella Perón. He died in 1974, and then Isabella took over for 2 years.
Right.
And then something happened.
Yes, so Juan Perón, who is arguably the most important Argentine politician in the country's history, certainly in the 20th century, as you said, blazed back to power in 1974 after a multiple decade exile. Then he passed away after only 9 months in office and left his vice president, his third wife, Isabelita, in power. And she had no political experience and no background in anything that would prepare her for the seriousness of governing a country that at that time was roiled by political violence and fierce polarization, economic chaos. And there's a statistic that by 1975, a bomb was going off in Argentina every 3 hours, and a political killing was happening every 5 hours. And this was largely the result of leftist revolutionary groups that had sprouted, and then right-wing paramilitaries that had also emerged, and they were clashing furiously with each other during this time. And when Isabelita took power, things really spiraled, and that allowed the military to have a justification to step in under the guise of restoring order. But they had this much larger plan, which was to restore what they deemed Western and Christian values to Argentina. And that required, in their mind, the disappearance of thousands of Argentines whose ideas they deemed to be subversive, including the pregnant women who are the subject of my book.
Well, just back to Perón for a moment. Perón was an autocrat. He was exiled and then he came back. Autocrats who were exiled tend to be exiled and then come back. I mean, Napoleon did, and we can think of some others as well. So Perón comes back, and then after he dies, there are Peronists. And are they the left or the right in Argentina?
They were both, which is a very curious feature of Perón. He was a textbook populist. He really, there was a quote, and I'm not going to remember it verbatim, but from a journalist who interviewed him. And it was about how people left meetings with him, fascists would leave meetings with him believing he was a fascist, and Maoists would leave meetings with him believing he was a Maoist. He just had this way of projecting back to someone whatever they wanted to see, and that allowed both the left and the right to project their hopes and dreams onto him in a really curious way. And when he died, those two factions really clashed over what was the true legacy of Perón.
Okay, so after Isabelita is forced out, the bad guy comes in, the head of a military junta, and his name was Jorge
Rafael Videla.
Videla was the mastermind of all these snatchings and kidnappings and murders. And who were the targets? Who were the victims? And how many were there?
As I mentioned, Videla's self-professed goal was to restore, quote unquote, Western and Christian civilization values to the country. And he took a very wide view of what that meant. So certainly...
Well, is murder a Western and Christian civilization
Not
value?
since I checked, but he was a very pious Catholic himself, and even late into his life, before he died, was quoted saying that God never let go of his hand. He felt as though what he was doing was divinely mandated. And his dragnet was incredibly wide during the period that he ruled over Argentina. So it certainly included members of the leftist revolutionary groups, but also included priests who ministered to the poor, nuns, lawyers who defended the families of the disappeared, journalists, artists, poets. And the exact number of desaparecidos is still blurry, which is a testament to how effectively the military was able to obscure the extent of their crimes. Human rights groups estimate that 30,000 people were disappeared. Some people project that the number was lower, but that's a widely accepted estimate from human rights groups themselves.
Desaparecidos in Argentina were the disappeared ones.
Exactly.
Right. Now, he did say the repression is directed against a minority we do not consider Argentine. A terrorist is not only someone who plants bombs, but a person whose ideas are contrary to our Western Christian civilization. Where have we heard this before? Do you find this whole scenario of snatching people, taking them away, separating families, talking about ideas that are un-American, does this resonate with the United States today?
Certainly. So I started working on this book officially in 2021. Even then, recognizing that there were parallels between the history of Argentina and things that we were seeing in the United States even then. But I never could have imagined how relevant and urgent this history would feel today. I think there are clear and eerie parallels in the imagery of Argentina's dictatorship and things we're seeing in the United States. You already mentioned masked officers who are not identifying what force they're from and are detaining people in unmarked cars without explanation or seemingly due process. I think we are far from the depths to which Argentina sank, where, as you mentioned, the military was loading groups of people into planes and helicopters and pushing them alive out into the sea and to the river that passed by Buenos Aires. But I think Argentina's history holds really powerful lessons about the depths that a country can sink to when the government puts its agenda before due process and the rule of law. And I think the grandmothers are a really powerful example of how ordinary citizens, even those who are underestimated and overlooked, as the grandmothers were as elderly women, can work together and claw back power and can resist.
Now, roughly how many infants, newlyborns, disappeared?
The grandmothers estimate that 500 babies and children were stolen in the dictatorship.
And how did they go about identifying them? I mean, this went on for about 20 years, didn't it? Many of the, in fact, all of them really grew into adulthood. And so you have kind of a different scenario playing out.
It's actually an ongoing mission. So the abuelas continue, those who are still alive. There are several grandmothers who are still living today. They range in age from their late 80s to mid-90s. The main subject of my book, Rosa Rosenblit, just passed away a week or so ago at the age of 106.
You interviewed her, right?
I did. Yes, I did, which was incredible. It was wonderful.
Just sidetrack. Tell us a little bit about her background and also her story about her granddaughter and grandson.
She was a remarkable person, and I think her longevity is a real reflection of the iron force of her will and determination. She was a first-generation Argentine. She was born to Eastern European Jews who had immigrated to Argentina during the pogroms, both sides of her family. And she was always incredibly ambitious. So even as a young girl in the 1920s, 1930s, she always dreamed of making it to a big city and having a career at a time when that wasn't that common. And so she became an obstetrician very young and ended up in Buenos Aires, where she met her husband, Benjamin, and they had one daughter who became, as you can imagine, the center of their universe. They poured everything into her. And in 1978, their daughter, Patricia, was among the thousands of Argentines abducted during the dictatorship. And she happened to be 8 months pregnant at the time with her second child.
And she was abducted with her daughter, Mariana, and also her husband.
That's exactly right.
They went to a toy store.
Yes, so her husband, Jose, had opened a toy store on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, a toy and party supply store. And on the night of October 6th, 1978, he was kidnapped from that toy store by officers who swept in and dragged him out to a military vehicle. And then cars showed up outside of the apartment he shared with Patricia and took her and their 15-month-old daughter as well. Curiously, Mariana, the 15-month-old daughter, was actually returned to family that night, so she was not raised by a military or police family. But Patricia, who was 8 months pregnant, was taken and put in detention and held until she gave birth in November of that year.
And then she was murdered, and the husband was tortured and murdered.
Yes, although one of the cruelest facts of the dictatorship is that there is no certainty around most of the murders that the military perpetrated. That's why they call them disappearances. And there was an extra brutality to this style of killing people because it leaves the families of the disappeared without anything to hold on to and any closure about the nature of their deaths. So,
and so many were dropped into the Rio de la Plata.
Exactly. So their bodies were swept away, the evidence of their murders were swept away, and it means that many of the families of the disappeared in Argentina don't know how their loved ones died, don't know when, don't know where their bodies are, don't have a place to grieve them. And that was the case with Patricia and Jose. Their families don't really know what ended up happening to them, and they haven't been seen.
There's so much to the story, but just briefly tell us about the role of DNA identification. Early on, you could use DNA to exclude parentage, but not necessarily to include it. And then it would be particularly difficult if it was a grandmother, if there were no living parents. But how did that evolve?
This was one of the most exciting aspects of this history for me to research. It wasn't something that I was aware of previously, but the grandmothers actually pioneered genetic genealogy as we know it, which is now widely used as a tool by law enforcement agencies and forms the backbone of family heritage companies like Ancestry.com. Many of the grandmothers had never met their grandchildren. They disappeared when they were still in utero, when their mothers were pregnant with them. And so the grandmothers recognized early on they would need to turn to science in order to identify and reclaim those grandchildren because they didn't know their eye color, their sex, they didn't know if they had birthmarks. So they needed some sort of objective tool that would allow them to be identified. And for years, they traveled around the world trying to find a scientist who could help them. And this was a time when DNA testing wasn't even available yet. And so many scientists didn't know what to do with their request. And then ultimately, they connected with Dr. Mary Claire King, who is now a world-famous geneticist. She was responsible for finding the BRCA1 breast cancer gene. And immediately, Dr. King agreed to work with the abuelas, and they were able to devise an entirely new form of genetic testing that allowed grandparents and grandchildren to be connected without any blood from the parental generation. And this really empowered the grandmother's mission, as you can imagine, and allowed them to start finding many more.
Now, there's another aspect of the story. Of course, these infants were adopted shortly after birth by members of the military or others affiliated in the government, and they raised these children, and the children came to think of their adoptive parents as their real parents. There was an emotional bond. So is it true that some of them really didn't want to know what the real story was behind their birth, and then some of them, even after they were told, preferred to remain with the adoptive parents who had loved them and raised them and nurtured them?
Yes, you're getting at one of the themes that I found most interesting that is explored in the book, which is what makes a family? Is it blood? Is it genetics? Is it love? And can you truly have love if that love is built on a lie? These children were not only adopted by these military and police families, but their identities were falsified so that they believed they had been raised by their biological parents and not members of the military and police who were perhaps even complicit in the deaths of their biological parents. So this was all very interesting for me to explore and devastating also. And I think the grandmothers early on in their mission felt that finding their grandchildren would be the most difficult challenge they faced. And then they quickly discovered, as you pointed out, that actually there were all these really complex dynamics that arose when they did find them. So they did encounter grandchildren who had grown, as you can imagine, very attached to the people that they thought were their real parents and whom they'd been raised by, and did not want to uproot and go live with their biological family all of a sudden. And sometimes that provoked really fierce custody battles when the grandchildren were still minors. And then once they grew up, these dynamics continued, and there were some grandchildren that very vehemently resisted DNA testing because they did not want to be uprooted. They didn't want their lives to be shattered. They'd grown up in a certain environment with certain parents, and they were content to continue on in that vein.
Now, Rosa did find her grandson in adulthood, which is one happy ending to this horrible story. But let's just move on to crime and punishment, because Argentina, like Brazil, seems willing to prosecute their former leaders and send them to prison if they've committed crimes. Tell us what happened to Mr. Videla, General Videla.
Interestingly, Argentina, as it has in its politics, has really swung between these dual impulses of justice and forgetting. And very soon after the dictatorship ended, the democratic president who came in began a push to prosecute the junta that had perpetrated the dictatorship. And they were successfully convicted in 1985. Videla was convicted to life in prison. But then, just to summarize many years of history, other presidents came in who believed that the fact that Videla was in prison was actually harming national reconciliation and harmony, and freed him.
Making them look like a banana republic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so he was sprung out of prison by a government helicopter. And then ultimately it was the grandmothers who landed him back in jail, where he died in 2013. And they did that by proving in 2012 that the plan to kidnap their grandchildren was a systematic plan. It wasn't just the whim of a few depraved individuals. There was actually a plan that was hatched by the military top brass, and they proved that in court. And so Videla was put back into prison, and he died there in 2013.
And at his trial, he made the chilling statement, "The women giving birth, who I respect as mothers, were militants who were active in the machine of terror. Many used their unborn children as human shields." That was Mr. Videla.
Yes, it's incredibly chilling. He also fell asleep in one of the hearings, which goes to show you how much he felt bored or felt convinced of his moral rectitude. But the court thankfully didn't see it the same way.
Well, that parallels our history as well. But I've come to the end of the road, and I have a question for you, Haley. And the question is, what are we to take from this marvelous piece of research that you did and of journalistic reporting? It's just excellent.
Thank you so much. That means a lot coming from you. I think when I think about the most salient lesson of this book, it is about these women, the grandmothers, who had no power, no platform, they had no money, but they used every tool available to them. So the law, science, as we talked about, the media, and they used those tools to stand up to one of the most brutal dictatorships in world history. And I think that lesson is one that is universal and extremely relevant today, and it speaks to how ordinary people can powerfully resist tyranny. And I think that's what I hope people take from the book.
The lesson is we must resist tyranny. Haley, thank you so much for coming by. Thank you so much for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Get our app so you can listen to this program and other programs when you're on the road. Meanwhile, be well, take care. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best.